kick away. So welcome, Mark and team. I'll allow you just to take us through the briefing.
Sure, thank you. Good to be in front of you again.
Just reminding, you're giving us advice only. This is not a decision-making briefing, and it's open to the public. So, fire away.
Thank you, Chair. Kia ora, everyone. Like I said, good to be in front of you again.
All right, keep going.
Today we're talking about the decision that is being recommended for the 4th of September. And that is parts of the city centre zone, a number of qualifying matters. And as you've just highlighted, Chair, staff are advising on making a decision now rather than the merits of the accept and reject as well. And we'll just cover off the next steps that we intend for the process. As no doubt you're all familiar with now, just for reference, this is where we're at in the process. There's still a period of clarifications that we are seeking. The decision is still required by the 12th of September for those policies 3 and 4 matters related to the NPSUD, and anything that gets rejected, it goes to the Minister for accept or rejection. Again, as a reminder, there's the usual rules for decision making, keeping an open mind, having read and understand the relevant information, and avoiding those discussions, commenting on IHP recommendations as well. Again, just for reference, the sole matters that you're seeking to consider in terms of your decision making are the materials that have been provided to the IHP, as per some of the IHP information summaries that you've received as well. So in terms of September 4th accept and reject decisions, I thought we'd cover off why we aren't recommending to consider some of the other commercial areas as part of the September 4th. There are a number of, many actually, walking catchments that we have as part of the wider policy through response for intensification around commercial centres. That's currently going through a mapping validation process with the hearings panel. We sent them a memo last week summarising all of the changes that we have done to reflect, or as we see, to reflect the recommendations that they've put forward. And that is being considered at the moment by the IHP. That also involves actually drawing where the boundaries fall for the catchments that they've directed. So primarily the main aspect of that is around those local centres. As you may recall, the IHP directed that local centres should have all should have a 200-metre walking catchment, but they obviously didn't stipulate where that fell in terms of the parcel. So we've had to do that for about 26 or so centres and draw it to the parcel extent, and so that's being validated by the hearings panel. Of course, with the walking catchments that's related to residential controls, we do have a process still to work through in terms of meeting the recommendations by the IHP to redraft the residential chapter, and we seek that it's better as an integrated proposal to make a decision on rather than piecemeal. They're an integrated concept. Policy 3D of the NPSUD is the direction for intensification both within and around those commercial centres, and so accordingly they should be considered together as well. Broadly, the criteria that we've used in terms of considering what we recommend is appropriate to consider on the 4th of September is where there are no clarifications needed by the independent hearings panel, and again it's not intertwined with those residential chapter decisions. So in terms of the recommendations that are being put forward for the 4th of September, again, it is part of the Central City Zone, otherwise known as CCZ, that are unaffected by outstanding IHP queries. Now, we did yesterday receive a response to one of the queries that we had for that, and so we don't yet have any advice on that. We're still considering the outcomes of that response by the IHP. In terms of the qualifying matters, we're putting forward those that are unmodified operative qualifying matters. They're effectively rolling over the current controls, both within and outside of the Central City Zone. The operative qualifying matters where there's little modification, again, both within and outside that area. and then there's one new qualifying matter and one modified qualifying matter that we'll delve into in a second as well. So by the end of the year, there will be the decision for the remainder of those policy 3 areas at a minimum in accordance with the direction and the Gazette notice by the Minister to consider those matters. Also the remaining qualifying matters, which there are about 20 or so for, and the financial contributions for tree canopy cover. So the map that we've shown there on the right and was circulated last week seeks to highlight the areas that are quote unquote clean in terms of any further clarifications or otherwise. And so all the areas in red we were seeking clarification by the IHP on, and so effectively what we're recommending is that those areas that are unaffected by that can be decided on next week on the 4th September. Just as a quick summary in terms of the recommendations on the IHP for the zone, the IHP has recommended the introduction of a permitted activity for buildings up to 28 metres. At the moment, any building within the central city requires resource consent, so this is obviously a fair step change to not require any resource consent for 28 metres. There's a controlled activity, which means the resource consent is required but must be granted, and that is possible if the certification pathway is achieved, which is effectively getting validation through the urban design panel. That is between 28 to 45 metres. The IHP have also recommended the removal of the proposed discretionary activity building height ceiling that was notified at 90 metres as well, and so effectively anything beyond 45 metres is also simply just a restricted discretionary activity, which means any applicant and council can only consider specific matters rather than the entirety of the plan as well. So it is wholeheartedly more enabling than the notified proposal for the central city. The areas that are outside, as in the ones that are covered in red, will be considered in the second part of the decision by the end of the year. Worthwhile to note that in terms of the areas that have been excluded, the extents are based on those notified positions for those relative qualifying matters that we're seeking clarification on. We haven't received any proposals to change the size of those qualifying matters, and so the zoning around that has been drawn accordingly. It's an important aspect to raise because it limits any kind of expansion or controls within that area at a further decision at the end of the year.
Just to clarify on that point, the map that was on the preceding slide, council will be asked to decide on the purple shaded areas, but excluding the red areas. The red, in the context of this slide here, is the maximum extent of those qualifying matters, and there's been no changes signalled by councillors to this. Sorry.
Thanks, Mark. In terms of the qualifying matters that we're recommending decision on, there's basically 3 different categories for those. As I said, there's a large number that are operative, as in they are within the current district plan and there's no proposed changes to them, and are listed there in the blue. The ones in the purple are effectively with minor modification, qualifying matter for public open space, so the park areas. And whether are new or modified, there's a newly introduced wastewater constraint qualifying matter for vacuum sewers, which you'll be aware of, and also the modified qualifying matter for heritage items and settings, where some of those have been recommended to be removed. So in terms of the public open space, funnily enough, it's a prescribed qualifying matter. It protects our parks, our current open space zoned areas. Captures all of the open space zones and some of this what's called specific purpose zones, such as cemeteries or the Otakaro Avon River Corridor. Alternate zones within the specific purpose zone for Otakaro Avon River Corridor seek to effectively highlight those privately owned sites and reflect adjoining zoning, and so this is the recommendation from the hearings panel that only those 3 sites are added to the schedule of the alternate zones, as they're excluded in the current framework, and we received submissions on that aspect as well. The wastewater constraints overlay, again, as you'll know, restricts development for no net new demand on the network, and applies in Preston's, Aranui, and parts of Shirley. For heritage items and settings, it's really only those where submissions were received. So 6 were proposed to be removed from the current plan or recommended by the IHP, 9 to be retained or amended, and the remaining operative schedule to be accepted. So in terms of council resolutions, the recommendation for qualifying matters crosses both the central city zone and policy 3 areas and medium density areas. The zoning recommendation that we're putting forward for the 4th September is focused on central city. Therefore, qualifying matters can only take effect from this area. And so what you may notice in terms of the resolutions that's put forward is that all other parts of qualifying matters that lie outside of that there would be so-called conditional support on those recommendations, because we're not actually implementing MDRS in those areas. So for example, only the open space qualifying matter, water body setbacks, significant trees and heritage item settings qualifying matters are applicable to the central city zone. The rest will be considered when we consider those zonings at a later date. In terms of the next steps, obviously the council meeting on the 4th September to consider what we've discussed just now. We have just received, as I said yesterday, the clarification regarding the High Court that we issued on the 19th of August to the IHP. Like I mentioned, on the 23rd of August, we issued a memo to the IHP regarding mapping clarifications, and there will be some additional queries that we're seeking, hopefully by the end of the week as well. We are awaiting the response from the Minister, albeit that we sent the letter on the 22nd of August, late last week, but we remain in open contact with the ministries on that aspect. And like I said, decisions on the outstanding parts, mainly those policy 3 areas, are required by the end of the year for Plan Change 14. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ike. Well done. So we do have questions. Tyler, Mark and then Yanni.
Kia ora. Just for public knowledge, just wanting to refer to the wastewater QM. And would it be fair to say that outside of the recommended QM that we've got here, that there are no other wastewater constraints across the rest of the city?
That's correct. There were, there were some recommendations from the hearings panel that sought to reduce the amount of intensification as a result of infrastructure-related evidence for certain aspects, most notably for North Horswall. But you're right, there aren't any other qualifying matters related to wastewater.
Okay, so if there was going to be further development up to high residential zoning, that there will not need to be any further infrastructure requirements.
That's right in terms of a planning mechanism, but we have controls through our existing bylaws, quite new bylaws, regarding capacity for all 3 waters, and that effectively requires that sufficiency must be met to deliver any proposed development. And so council still reserves the right to deny building consent, for example, if there isn't such capacity that's there. And that's the case at the moment before these qualifying matters in certain parts of the city where building consent is denied because of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mark, then Yanni.
Thank you. So the September 4th decision is purely around the central city, effectively.
Correct.
So that would exclude the likes of Hornby, Papanui,
Yep.
and the other
That's
commercial
right.
centres.
It's just central city. Yep.
Yep. And with that, the recommended for rejection sunlight access has no bearing on that decision September 4th.
No, the sunlight access qualifying matter is only related to MDRS, which is residential zone, so there's no influence on that zone. Yeah.
And I guess just as an extra question for the the listening public as well, you're still waiting further confirmations from the IHP around things like the walkable catchments around the commercial centres, e.g. Hornby.
That's right. That's part of the mapping validation that we issued last week. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Yanni.
Yeah, cool. Just looking at the map around the Margaret Mahi playground, there's no qualifying matter around that.
I don't believe there is. No.
You could have 90 metre. No, sorry, you could have 200 metre buildings right up against that, blocking sun, creating wind.
So there's definitely matters of discretion that we have to control building form, and so wind is part of that. And so it doesn't mean that there's unabated buildings that can be progressed at, like you say, however tall they may be. There are from 45 metres onwards, there's a restricted discretionary activity resource consent that's required. And so there are specific matters that we can control in terms of making sure that, for example, pedestrian safety or any other nearby safety and amenity from wind effects or otherwise are controlled accordingly.
But effectively, what we could see is no height limit next to the playground. Buildings could be as tall as they can build.
Subject to meeting the conditions of the resource consent controls that we have there. It's a theoretical case, you're right. For the central city zone, there isn't an explicit height limit like there's in the current district plan.
Right. And if we wanted to protect the playground, what would we do? What's the best way to do that?
Well, I guess at the end of the day, your decision making is guided by what has been put forward in front of the independent hearings panel. And so if there is a submission or evidence that relates to seeking, for example, a qualifying matter for public open space that is more onerous, then the councillors would have to consider the merits of that in terms of any alternate recommendations.
Right. But it does say that operative plan with minor modification qualifying matter for public open space. So technically we could make amendments to that.
Yeah, an alternate recommendation could be put forward, absolutely. But again, the recommendation needs to be grounded on evidence that was presented to the IHP. So you'd have to seek evidence or a submission that sought that kind of change.
Right, okay.
And there hasn't been any.
And it has to be specific. We can't use high-level principled submissions that talk about protecting green space or protecting amenity. We have to actually specifically go, someone said that particular site, that particular building should have a qualifying matter.
Well, what you're proposing, councillor, is that you would be introducing an alternative recommendation to the IHP's recommendation. So the report that we've discussed going to the council on the 4th of September is recommending accept the IHP recommendations solely because the mayor and elected members have not requested any changes to the IHP recommendations. Yeah. So if you do want to propose an alternative recommendation, we've previously said that council officers can help with a drafting service, if you like, if you've identified some evidence and submissions in the IHP records that you wish to rely on, and then staff can help you draft your alternative recommendation that your colleagues can consider.
So those are key points. If anyone wants to introduce something new at this stage, you have to find the evidence in the submissions to support that and seek staff advice to draft it, and then you have to get support of elected members to agree to it around the table. Otherwise, we're pretty much accepting the recommendations that are coming to us next week.
And the impact of this on the Central City Recovery Plan, this basically overrules the Central City Recovery Plan. So effectively, the Central City Recovery Plan for all the things that people wanted around green space in the inner city, or good urban design, that basically is done away with now, right? This overrides that chapter in the district plan.
The Central City Recovery Plan was implemented by being put into the district plan, and this is changing the district plan.
Right.
Yes.
So effectively, okay, yep. And just one other thing. Can you help me understand the types of qualifying matters to decide on? My understanding was we can't change those. So you've got the operative plan, sites of ecological significance, cultural significance, water body setbacks. I thought we couldn't change those to be more onerous than what's in our current district plan. So, for example, this won't come as any surprise, but sites of ecological significance along the Apawaho Heathcote River, for example, which, community probably want extended because it's not sufficient at the moment and it's allowing development that's having an adverse impact on the river. But we couldn't say, instead of having a 30-metre setback, we want a 50-metre setback or a 100-metre setback as a qualifying matter. That just wouldn't be in scope. Is that kind of how we read it?
Well, I guess we're highlighting that the IHP have recommended that those specific qualifying matters, like the one you've mentioned, carry over as per they are in the operative district plan, i.e. no change. They support no change, which was the position that council put forward as well. I guess in terms of any of the change, it's the same answer as previously. If there is a submission or otherwise that seeks a modification of that, then it'd have to come through as an alternate recommendation based on the submission that was received to seek a modification of that qualifying matter.
Sorry, I guess just to be really clear though, I guess what I'm struggling with is this feels very much like we're reviewing our entire district plan and we're coming up with things that have a whole bunch of other outcomes than just allowing residential development. And so I always thought as part of this process we couldn't put stuff in that was either more onerous or actually was changing our district plan to get better outcomes, because we could only deal with the greater density.
Just something to bear in mind is the plan change is about centres and areas around centres and then relevant residential zones. So this plan change doesn't provide the scope to increase the setbacks for ecological areas or open space of industrial zone land adjoining the Apawaho, as an example.
So that's done through a separate plan change. So, Tyrone, please.
Mr. Tyrone. So the things I'm interested in, residential heritage areas, the Littleton Port Influences Overlay. Is that the same as the Port Noise Overlay? Or is that different?
The same.
Right, thank you. And sunlight, which of those things do I care about on the 4th of September?
Well, I guess the easy answer is none, potentially, because what we're saying is that the Littleton Port Influences Overlay isn't obviously within the central city, and so the recommendation is that there's conditional support on where the IHP landed, and council will consider it fully when it considers the zoning within that area. And so it's more of a decision in principle for that particular qualifying matter. The other two that you've mentioned in terms of the heritage areas, we're not seeking a decision on the 4th. Heritage items and settings, again, are only within the central city themselves. And yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Do people need guidance?
Sunlight, don't worry, that's going to be considered
Sunlight
with MDRS. I know that,
Yeah,
I know
that'll be
that, which is
accepted,
fine. So just to clarify on the RHAs, so Littleton RHAs,
Not considered
not
next
considered.
week.
That's
No,
the important thing. That's the main one. Thank you.
Great. Tyler, you got another question? And then Andre, I think, still has one.
Yep. I'll start with the more particular one, was around the heritage part. Now, I just want to be clear here. So there is a property on Riccarton Road. And so are we saying that we're going to be pushing that decision for the Riccarton Road property out to December? It's the church. Under heritage queuing.
That's right, yeah. So we're only making the decision on those qualifying matters in terms of their legal effect and the influence within the central city zone. Obviously, Riccarton Road isn't subject to that, and so the decision that we're making as previous is just in principle. You're able to decide that later on in December or whenever the next decision meeting comes.
And why wouldn't heritage be included in September 4th outside of it just being a part of the...
Because we're
central
not considering the zoning.
Okay, I got you. The next question is speaking in generalities here, but I'm just trying to gain an understanding. I see there are quite a few colleagues having issues with perception, aka evidence-based submitters versus lay submitters that come in and talk about their experiences. Can we just sort of define and understand how the IHP came to their decisions, and if they balanced I guess, the social impact alongside evidence-based submissions.
Tough
This
one to
is a
answer, to
hot
be
pocket. I
honest.
threw you a hot potato, but I just wanted to see if you're able to provide some insight as to what a normal commissioner would do when they're thinking about these and balancing.
Probably just a general response. Yeah. Is that?
Yeah.
No.
No, but I mean, it's a difficult one to answer because you've got to get inside their head, I suppose. But I mean, can you come back to perhaps?
It's just speaking in generalities as a commissioner, so we can understand exactly what we're voting on.
The commissioners are required to still consider a layperson's evidence, absolutely. And there are instances in the recommendation where lay evidence has been quite instrumental in terms of where they have deliberated on their recommendations. For example, the Central City walking catchment, where you had submitters talking about the distances it is to walk within the Central City, and that is evident in their decision making, or their recommendations, I should say, where they've sought that to recommend a reduced walking catchment because of lay evidence. So absolutely it is considered alongside expert evidence, but the weighting of that is also relevant at the end of the day in terms of the merits of the argument. It's not discounted, is what I'm saying. It's absolutely considered, but it comes to a merits point at the end of the day.
That's a fantastic answer, and that does relate to September. So that was really good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ike. Andre, do you still have a question?
Oh, I do.
Right, far away.
Thank you. Or just to address Yanni's concerns, there's new townhouses being built all around Margaret May. So someone's not going to demolish those and put high rises in, but also there's no evidence whatsoever that housing will harm the playground in any way. So I don't think that's worth being concerned about.
Thank you for that.
You mentioned around wastewater constraints. You mentioned North Hallsville. Are you just able to touch a bit more on that?
Yeah, so the point that I was making was that we had recommended, as you might know, high density zoning around North Hallsville, and there were submissions by nearby landowners that incorporated expert evidence regarding infrastructure, and the IHP, as part of their recommendations, considered that was appropriate, and as a result of that has recommended that the high density zoning isn't progressed, and instead medium density in a specific location is instead progressed. So there isn't a qualifying matter overlay as such, to be clear, that they're recommending. They're simply using infrastructure evidence to recommend a lesser intensification.
But sorry, was that around wastewater constraints specifically?
Yes, wastewater.
It was,
I think stormwater potentially as well.
Yeah, and whereabouts did that evidence come from?
It was from Dannemora, Submitter, and Milnes Park, and their associated experts.
Okay, this one. Okay, gotcha. No, that's great. Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. And I think just since you commented on the Margaret Mayhew, I think for clarification, we need to note that one boundary is the river, one boundary is Manchester Street, one boundary is Armour Street. Then there's a car park on the eastern boundary, and there's only one site that could possibly be built on, and that's over by Madras. So I think Margaret Mayhew's fairly safe, and I think we could say it was a really great site to consider to put the playground on. Yanni, do you have a question?
Safe from big bad housing.
Yeah, it's not an issue with
Last
housing.
word.
You need to understand it's the issue of the effects of the height. So I know a lot of councillors weren't here when council was taken to the Environment Court over Victoria Square, but there were some really good planning principles around urban design, urban amenity that the judge actually found in favour of the residents who went there, which was to kind of have stepped back from areas of high amenity, which gets a much better urban outcome. So it's not a question of not having housing next to the playground, but you do actually want to protect things like shading, sunlight,
Just to
access.
clarify too, over 45 metres, those considerations will be still part of the resource consent process.
Yeah.
So like shading, etc., will still need to be
But
considered.
at the moment, there's not 45 metres buildings being built there. They would be significantly higher to, but just wanted to check in terms of the slide. When it says removes discretionary activity building height ceiling, that's only for residential, or is that for any building?
Oh no, it's for any building.
So basically, you might not even have housing there, right? You could have something else. So with all the adverse impacts that might have,
Can you just
in terms of traffic
clarify?
generation,
Can you just clarify, because it's a designated site at the moment, is it? The East Frame,
Yeah, that's right.
which doesn't have height controls.
I'm not sure about the designations ins and outs, sorry.
but in terms of the decision on September 4th,
Yep.
it's not just about housing. This isn't about just getting more housing.
I'm just not sure where you're going with this.
I'm just
Yanni.
clarifying that the decision that we're making on September 4th isn't just relative to housing. This is actually relative to any building that's been built within this area. No longer having a height limit.
Yep. So
no longer having
why should it matter what the use of the building is?
Sorry, I thought the point of this was to get more housing, more affordable housing for people. We've heard a number of people criticise me for raising that, concerned about housing.
Oh, how do we answer
It's
that?
not just about housing, so I just wanted to clarify that. So is there any other restrictions on the types of activity in terms of the buildings?
In terms of the form, no, it's not. I don't believe it's tied to the types of the use. I guess, though, within the central city, it's important to note that residential development is still very much an anticipated outcome. So, for example, you are able to have, as you are currently, shops or commercial use along the ground floor, and then an apartment for all the floors above that. And so the majority of in use could very well be majority in residential use. So this enables apartments alongside office spaces and everything in between.
Right.
Just to briefly answer the question the principal advisor raised about the land to the south of Margaret Mahy Playgrounds. It's been subject to a designation which was introduced by the Christchurch Central Recovery Plan to provide for the East Frame, and within that East Frame it includes a range of activities, including residential. There's no condition on that designation by way of a height limit, so that's what was introduced by way of the recovery plan. There is a built form standard for development that's not within the scope of the designation, but that's a different matter.
Right, thank you. All right, so that seems to be the end of the questions. Very good answers here, thank you. So we will just await the report on the 4th of September.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, not predetermined.